From east to west, from north to south, they tried to hunt the column out, but the towns were forced to go without the boys of Barry's column. This prison scum in brown and black, no tanks or war equipment like, but o'er the sea they'll ne'er get back at the cut by Barry's column. Oh, but isn't it great to see the Tommies and the R.I.C. black and tans and staters flee away from Barry's column. From prison cells they came to stay and wipe out Irish boys away, but oh, their lovely holiday was stopped by Barry's column. Lloyd George may have some wily tricks on how the volunteers to fix, but all his black and tans go sick to think of Barry's column.
During the early 20th century, in the South African bushveld and Irish countryside, insurgencies threatened to overturn British imperial rule. The response to each was ruthless and attacked the civilian population. In South Africa, Boer farms were destroyed and homeless families were interned in concentration camps, where tens of thousands of women and children died from starvation and disease. Famously, Sir Herbert Kitchener's scorched earth policy was branded as methods of barbarism by Liberal Campbell Bannerman. Blockhouses and barbed wire fences were built while colonial cavalry hunted down the tenacious bitter enders. 2 decades after Britain's costly victory in the Veldt, Ireland erupted. British authorities deemed the volunteers of the Irish Republican Army, I.R.A., to be criminals and rebels, rather than a legitimate enemy to declare war upon. Instead of using a well-orchestrated scorched earth policy, British paramilitaries retaliated for IRA activity by terrorising the population. In July 1920, the Galway Express wrote, "When they throw petrol on a Sinn Féiner's house, they are merely pouring paraffin on the flames of Irish nationality." In response to this counterproductive British terror, the IRA destroyed the mansions of loyalist landlords and shot collaborators. In guerrilla days in Ireland, Tom Barry, commandant of the IRA's 3rd West Cork Brigade, wrote that Britain used against the Irish the instrument which was so successful against the Boers. That instrument of terror was fire. This comparison can be extended further, exploring and contrasting the ways in which the Empire attended to quell these insurgencies. This will ultimately reveal why the Boers were defeated, whereas the IRA forced their enemy to the negotiating table. To begin with, the Boers and Irish did not use guerrilla tactics. It was only when huge British armies overran Transvaal and the Orange Free State that Boers stopped fighting in pitched battles. Although Lord Roberts was made a Knight of the Garter by Queen Victoria for his victory in South Africa in September 1900, a large number of Boers refused to surrender. These bitter enders launched a guerrilla campaign that would last 1.5 years. Meanwhile, Irish nationalists learned from the Easter Rising that trying to fight the British using conventional tactics would only lead to disaster. In 1916, when rebels seized control of the General Post Office in Dublin, British artillery blasted them into submission. Among those leaders who faced a firing squad after the Rising was John MacBride, who had been leader of the Irish Transvaal Brigade in the Boer War. Members of this unit would return from the Veldt with their Mauser rifles to resist the foreign occupier on their own turf. Irish nationalists had a strong affinity with the Boers' anti-imperialist struggle. The key to achieving Irish independence would be guerrilla warfare in the countryside, rather than attempting to defend strategic positions. Guerrilla means little war in Spanish, and is a fighting style characterized by irregular tactics. This involves avoiding pitched battles and harassing the enemy using hit-and-run tactics, laying ambushes and then disappearing. The guerrillas' aim is simply to outlast their opponents, demoralizing and slowly wearing them down through attrition. Famously, Napoleon called the Peninsular War his Spanish ulcer, because of how fighting the local partisans drained French manpower and resources. South Africa and Ireland were very much ulcers for the British Empire in the early 20th century. In Ireland, as well as South Africa, the British counter-insurgency involved a huge amount of manpower. In November 1919, Lord French was placed in command of 34 battalions, about 37,000 soldiers, and yet he still requested 2 more battalions to fight the IRA. Although Prime Minister Lloyd George told French, "You do not declare war against rebels," it was clearly felt that overwhelming military force would be needed to crush the insurgency. Winston Churchill, British Secretary of State for War, even raised paramilitary troops to support the Royal Irish Constabulary, RIC. These so-called Black and Tans, abbreviated to the Tans, were made up of unemployed veterans, mostly from London, Liverpool and Glasgow. Their name referred to the colour of their uniforms, a mixture of RIC black and British Army khaki, and the pack of Kerry beagles used in the Scarteen Hunt in County Limerick. The Tans first arrived in Dublin on the 25th of March 1920. No less than 11,500 of them would serve in Ireland during the conflict, gaining a reputation for ill discipline and barbarity. RIC Constable Eugene Bratton described them as a low-down lot of scoundrels. The auxiliaries, abbreviated to Auxies, were also formed, being comprised of ex-British officers who Barry described as surely the worst of the ruthless forces that occupied Ireland through the centuries. Similarly, in South Africa, the Empire had implemented auxiliary and paramilitary troops to help fight the Boer commandos. The Imperial Yeomanry was raised, as was cavalry from Canada, Australia and New Zealand. These colonials were no less used to the saddle and the rifle than the Boers. Wearing slouch hats and bandoliers, after months of bushfighting, these horsemen could look very similar to their ragged adversaries. However, Boer endurance and guerrilla skills remained unparalleled. So in September 1901, the British employed sympathetic Boers as scouts to help track down the bitter enders. These former commandos were probably motivated by bringing a swift end to the war, which was causing so much suffering for the interned civilian population. As in Ireland, the auxiliary troops became infamous for their cruelty. An English-born officer in the mostly Australian Bushveld Carbineers, Lieutenant Breaker Morant, was executed by firing squad for the cold-blooded murders of Boer prisoners. It should be noted that executing Boer POWs was British policy when commandos were caught wearing khaki, even though Commando Denis Reitz claimed that none of us wore captured uniforms with the deliberate intention of decoying the enemy, but only out of sheer necessity, in his journal. In an echo of Morant's killings on the veldt, 2 IRA men were arrested and subsequently murdered by the Auxies on the 27th of November 1920. The men's corpses were dreadfully mutilated, and hand grenades had been exploded in their mouths. In both conflicts, the British utilised auxiliaries in their counter-insurgencies. This bolstered Crown forces and was convenient when it came to the terror campaigns, as it deflected blame for atrocities away from the regular army. The 2 counter-insurgencies were focused on restraining enemy movements. During the Boers guerrilla campaign, the commandos largely abandoned their ox-wagon trains for speed of manoeuvre. On horseback, the Boers easily outpaced slow British infantry columns. French satire depicted Britain weighed down with a ball and chain, swiping at Piet de Wet, one of the Boer guerrilla leaders, with a butterfly net. In 1901, the British started erecting barbed wire fences and defensive blockhouses in order to trap the Boers in specific areas of the veldt. The guerrilla campaign was arduous and immensely frustrating for British forces, who felt bitterness against an enemy who would not fight or broke the rules when he did. Christian de Wet, the elder brother of Piet, was unfazed by what he called the blockhead system. In the winter of 1901, commandos raided British supplies, intended for the army camps and blockhouses. Before dawn on Christmas morning, they stormed a British camp at Tweefontein and shot down the yeomen as they scrambled from their tents. However, the blockhouse system was effective at improving the British lines of communication and hampering Boer mobility. Native Africans also played a vital role in the British war effort, working as forced labourers and scouts. Kitchener eventually confessed to arming over 10,000 Africans with rifles, whose job it was to assist in defending the blockhouse lines. This shocked the profoundly racist Boers and disproves the notion that it was a white man's war. During the conflict, Boer commandos stole cattle from African tribes, flogging and murdering those who supported the British. Similar to Boer commando units, IRA volunteers were organised into highly mobile flying columns. These were comprised of first-rate troops, serving as full-time soldiers of the Dáil, Irish Parliament, which was formed after the electoral victory of Sinn Féin in December 1918. Tom Barry, perhaps the most outstanding guerrilla leader of the 20th century, was among over 200,000 Irishmen who fought in the British Army in World War I. As the conflict intensified, the flying columns became more independent of the IRA's General Headquarters, GHQ, and no longer required any authorization for their actions. Perhaps the most successful action of Barry's column was the annihilation of a detachment of supposedly invincible auxiliaries on the road to Macroom. After some of the Auxies pretended to surrender and then resumed firing on the IRA, Barry ordered, "Rapid fire and do not stop until I tell you." All 18 Auxies were killed, one dying later of his wounds. Lord French claimed that it was a massacre, and the IRA had mutilated the bodies with axes. This was typical British propaganda, aimed at portraying the IRA as a gang of rebel murderers. Although the verdant Irish countryside was far less wild and expansive than the arid bushveld, it was still exceptionally difficult for Crown forces to pin down the IRA. The aim was to encircle and destroy the flying columns, but such a task proved extremely challenging. Flying columns would usually march up to 15 miles from the scene of an ambush, while bogs and mountains often slowed down a part of the encircling forces. This provided the column with a gap to escape through. Tom Barry was Ireland's de Wet, skillfully evading the British net. In both insurgencies, the guerrillas enjoyed support from sympathetic civilians who were persecuted by imperial forces as a result. Reitz wrote that gifts of coffee, sugar, salt and tobacco were ungrudgingly made to his unit by farming communities they met. The harshness of life on the veldt and supply shortages meant the Boers' clothing was ragged, and some were even without boots. One British soldier lamented that such miserable creatures were an enemy able to keep the flower of England's army in check. After the Boer republics fell, guerrillas had to rely upon donations of supplies from civilian non-combatants. Therefore, beginning in June 1900, the British carried out a scorched earth policy and torched farms owned by known commandos. As the guerrilla war progressed and became increasingly bitter, British soldiers wasted whole areas. Farmhouses were burned, crops were destroyed, and herds of livestock were massacred or seized. Resulting from this devastation of their civilian support base, commandos were left with little to eat but dried meat and maize porridge. Boers with the most experience of life on the veldt suffered the least from these chronic shortages. Hunting became a necessity to survive, although it was initially discouraged because of ammunition expenditure. Leaves from local plants were substituted for tobacco, and honey was taken from bees' nests. Wherever the commandos went, they were surrounded by desolation. Jan Smuts, a Boer leader, wrote of what he and his comrades saw in his diary. Dams everywhere full of rotting animals, water undrinkable, veldt covered with slaughtered herds of sheep and goats, cattle and horses. The horror passes description. The hardships endured by Boer civilians were even worse than those faced by the bitter enders. Kitchener set up 24 concentration camps to accommodate Boer families displaced from their smouldering farmsteads. Each camp had only a single doctor and a few nurses. Mismanagement, poor sanitation, and overcrowding led to starvation and epidemics of measles and typhoid. After the investigation by the 1901 Fawcett Commission exposed the terrible reality of the camps, steps were taken to reduce the rate of mortality, especially among children. Conditions were improved and the death rate fell significantly. However, by the end of the war, over 20,000 Boers and 12,000 native Africans had died in British concentration camps. It was no genocide, but demonstrated Kitchener's indifference to Boer suffering and determination to crush the bitter enders at all costs. Barry wrote of the support received by the I.R.A. from ordinary people during the War of Independence. Nearing the truce, unasked and unorganised, 9 out of every 10 of the adult civilian population were watching and reporting to us on the movements of British troops or the activities of any suspected British agent. Certainly the I.R.A. enjoyed the support of the majority of the Irish population, but they knowingly used targeted terror when necessary. Barry wrote that, while the South Africans had no loyalists' homes which could be destroyed as reprisals, Ireland was studded with the castles, mansions and residences of the British ascendancy who had made their homes here. So from January 1920 to July 1921, nearly 80 big houses were burned to the ground by the I.R.A., as the landowners who owned them tended to be generous hosts to the local British Army. The Anglo-Irish aristocracy had no sympathy for the volunteers, who were mostly drawn from the small farming classes in the countryside and the workers in the cities. The destruction of mansions was carried out with great zeal in County Cork, where up to a third of the ones destroyed were located. As Commandant of the West Cork Brigade, Barry also ordered the shooting of spies and informers who collaborated with the British. In particular, wealthy landowners with a vested interest in maintaining the British government were liable to be executed. When operating outside their home areas, the flying columns were sometimes met with nothing but lies, inaccuracies, disappointments, and incompetencies of the worst type. In South Galway, the I.R.A. rounded up all the passers-by and imprisoned them, as an example of what happened to those undedicated to the nationalist cause. Any girl who met up with British soldiers had their hair cut off so that she'll be held in contempt by all loyal citizens of the Irish Republic. The practice, known as bobbing, was aimed at humiliating the victim because short hair was very unfashionable at the time. On the other hand, Barry praised members of the Cumann, the women's auxiliary wing of the I.R.A. Their jobs included nursing the wounded and sick, carrying dispatches, scouting, acting as intelligence agents, arranging billets, raising funds, knitting, washing, cooking for the active servicemen, and burying our dead. British reprisals in Ireland served only to heighten resentment for imperial rule and win over the majority of the population to the nationalist cause. On the 21st of November 1920, 12 British soldiers were assassinated by the I.R.A., murdered in their lodgings, 9 of them still in their pyjamas. The Empire retaliated when auxiliaries opened fire on a crowd of civilians spectating a Gaelic football match between the Dublin and Tipperary teams on Croke Park. Claiming to have been shot at from the grandstand, the auxiliaries fired 220 or so rounds at the spectators. The Evening Herald reported that, at the sound of rifle fire, a great mass of people swept onto the playing pitch like an avalanche. Women and children were trampled on, the exits from the ground were choked, and the men and women fainted in their efforts to get away. Later that year, in December, the Black and Tans rampaged through Cork City, looting, wrecking, burning and drinking. When the fire brigade came to douse the flames on Patrick Street, the Tans slashed the hoses with their bayonets. The damage they inflicted on the city amounted to £3 million, equal to about £150 million today. In July 1920, there were also reprisals at Tuam. All across Ireland, Crown forces terrorised the population in retaliation for I.R.A. attacks. Barry and other Irish nationalists viewed the auxiliaries as an openly established terrorist body. This description is quite accurate, though I.R.A. men also committed acts of terrorism. The auxiliaries, each carrying a rifle, 2 revolvers and 2 Mills bombs, would drive into a village and begin ordering all inhabitants out of doors. Then everyone was lined up against the walls with their hands up, questioned and searched. Civilians were often beaten with the butt ends of their revolvers, belts and rifles. Predictably, these heavy-handed tactics of the British merely succeeded in eliciting more support for both Sinn Féin and for the I.R.A. In South Africa, the British had effectively used scorched earth and concentration camps to remove the Commando's vital support base and demoralise them. On the other hand, British terrorism in Ireland proved completely ineffective and worse in that it increased the determination of those fighting them. Kitchener's actions in South Africa sparked considerable backlash at home and internationally. With the Liberal opposition being divided and labelled as pro-Boer by the Tories, the khaki election of autumn 1900 resulted in a Conservative majority of 134 seats. However, as the conflict dragged on, a great moral crusade against the inhumane treatment of Boer civilians gained momentum, culminating in the aforementioned Fawcett Commission. At the forefront of it was Emily Hobhouse, who saw the horrendous camps with her own eyes and informed Liberal leader Campbell Bannerman about them. At a Liberal dinner party on the 14th of June 1901, he famously said, "When is a war not a war? When it is carried on by methods of barbarism in South Africa." The French accused Kitchener of committing genocide on the veldt, a claim which was both untrue and rather hypocritical for another empire to moralise about. On the 30th of April 1920, Lord French had suggested declaring war on the Irish Republic, as had been done in the Boer War when the rebels were seized and put into concentration camps. Although nothing on the scale of Kitchener's camps for Boer civilians, not rebels, as Lord French said, several internment camps were set up in Ireland. The largest of these was Ballykinlar in County Down, established in November 1920. This held 2,000 I.R.A. prisoners and 14 MPs of Dáil Éireann, with 25 men crammed into each wooden hut. Clearly, Britain's response to the Irish War of Independence was on a much smaller scale and less severe than in the Boer War. The main reason for this was Lloyd George's refusal to declare war and thus legitimise the I.R.A., rather than fear of public outcry. It should also be noted that public outcry did not help the Boer insurgency. By the end of 1901, Kitchener decided to stop interning Boer women and children because of the humanitarian hullabaloo about his policy. This burdened and greatly handicapped the guerrillas. In fact, it was less humane than the camps, where at least accommodation and supplies were provided for homeless families. In May 1902, the bitter enders finally surrendered and were offered generous terms. The Boers were granted amnesty and promise of self-government, allowing them to exclude native Africans from the franchise. A payment of £3 million and loans were also provided to help the Boers recover after the enormous devastation caused by Kitchener. In conclusion, the Boers were defeated because Kitchener successfully eliminated the Commando's civilian support by using scorched earth policy and concentration camps. The British Empire committed a huge amount of manpower and resources to the counter-insurgency, building fences and blockhouses across the veldt. Eventually, with their farms reduced to smouldering ruins and families rotting behind barbed wire, the bitter enders submitted after a dogged resistance. On the other hand, Lloyd George's insistence on claiming the I.R.A. were criminal rebels and his refusal to recognise the Irish Republic meant the counter-insurgency was more restricted. If Britain was not at war, nothing on the scale of what had occurred in South Africa could be justified in Ireland. Instead, British paramilitaries roamed the Irish countryside and made enemies wherever they went, strengthening the nationalist cause with their pillaging and abuse. Flying columns outmanoeuvred and outfought British forces on multiple occasions, aided by local sympathisers. Unlike indiscriminate British terror, which punished whole regions, the I.R.A. had more specific targets: aristocratic landlords, informants and spies. Civilians who showed reluctancy to support the Dáil or accompanied British soldiers were intimidated. In short, the I.R.A. was an effective guerrilla force and benefited from a highly inept counter-insurgency. As a result, a truce between the volunteers and Crown forces was agreed in July 1921, followed by the treaty, signed on the 6th of December 1921. It proclaimed the Irish Free State as a dominion of the British Empire, rather than a fully independent republic, and the 6 counties in the north were excluded. Many Irish nationalists viewed this as a betrayal of the cause and victory at the negotiating table. The subsequent civil war tore the Irish people between pro-treaty Free Staters and anti-treaty Republicans. Likewise, the Boers were resilient guerrilla fighters and had skilled leadership. However, unlike the I.R.A., they found themselves in a hopelessly unequal struggle against the full wrath of the British Empire.
I